I used to get shot at every other week, or every week, should I say. I've been stabbed. I've been fucking, there's many attacks on me.
For much of his early life, Sicarius McGrath's story was one of restlessness, conflict, and defiance. Born and raised in Liverpool, he grew up in a neighborhood that was almost entirely white, where right-wing attitudes and casual prejudice were the norm. As a boy, he had little interest in schoolwork, and religion played no real role in his life. His family background was Catholic, but Sicarius McGrath considered himself a person of no faith. In his early teens, petty crime became his escape. Small thefts, fights, and rebellious behavior quickly became routine. But the bullying he endured during those years would change the direction of his life. For a while it was verbal abuse and intimidation, then it became physical. He reached a breaking point and decided he would no longer be an easy target. That decision led him to something far more dangerous: firearms. By 2001, still barely out of his teens, Sicarius McGrath had made his first connections in Liverpool's underworld. Through acquaintances, he was introduced to individuals from Muslim backgrounds, some of whom were involved in gangs. They were the ones who helped him acquire his first gun. What started as protection soon became a weapon for intimidation, control, and profit. The streets were unforgiving, but with a firearm, Sicarius McGrath felt untouchable. He quickly became involved in armed robberies targeting drug dealers and others he believed would not go to the police. Rolex watches, cash, and large quantities of drugs became the prizes. For Sicarius McGrath, these weren't random acts. They were calculated moves, often executed with precision and the help of outsiders he brought in from other cities. His thinking was simple: the less local exposure, the harder it would be to get caught. But even in those early years, he had begun to admire people far beyond Liverpool. In the aftermath of major global events like the September 11th attacks, Sicarius McGrath found himself drawn not to the ideology, but to the rebelliousness and uncompromising stance of certain figures. He saw them as hardcore, the kind of characters who wouldn't bow to authority. This attraction had nothing to do with belief. It was about image, defiance, and chaos. As the years passed, his reputation grew. By 2004, police had connected him to multiple firearms offenses, a shooting and a stabbing. That year, he received a prison sentence, marking the start of a pattern that would define much of his adult life: freedom, crime, arrest, prison, release, then back to the same cycle. Yet even behind bars, Sicarius McGrath was restless. In the rigid environment of prison, he found new influences. The friendships he built, the people he observed, and the tensions he felt all began to feed a mindset that would eventually take him down a much darker path. This was the world Sicarius McGrath came from: a childhood marked by bullying, a teenage life fueled by crime, and an early adulthood already steeped in violence and defiance. It was a dangerous foundation, one that set the stage for the most radical transformation of his life. By the early 2000s, Sicarius McGrath was no stranger to prison walls. His first stint inside had already cemented his reputation as someone willing to push boundaries, but it was in these tightly controlled corridors that the seeds of something more dangerous began to grow. In 2001, he had already been fascinated by certain figures in the media, not because of their beliefs, but because they stood defiantly against governments and authority. To a young man with a criminal past and a deep resentment for the system, these individuals represented the ultimate form of rebellion. They were fearless, unyielding, and unapologetic. When he entered prison in 2004 for firearms offenses and violent crimes, he found himself mixing with inmates from all walks of life. Some were seasoned gangsters, others were serving time for politically motivated actions. Among them was a man whose reputation Sicarius already knew from the outside. This meeting didn't spark an immediate change, but it deepened his fascination with the idea of aligning himself with people who refused to play by conventional rules. By 2007, his direction shifted. In prison, he converted to Islam. The decision wasn't driven solely by faith. For him, it was also about identity, belonging, and connecting to a group that commanded respect in the environment he was in. He grew a beard, studied religious materials, and began to see the world through a sharper lens of us versus them. What began as admiration for rebellious figures turned into a more structured, extreme mindset. By 2008, while in segregation at HMP Forest Bank, Sicarius had begun planning something unthinkable, an armed attack in the UK. He envisioned targeting pubs and bars, places he saw as the heart of behaviors he despised, alcohol, drugs, and what he considered moral decay. He convinced himself that such an attack would be a strike against everything he rejected. His thinking was cold and calculated. These venues, he reasoned, wouldn't have children present, and that allowed him to justify the potential carnage in his own mind. He knew how to access firearms. He knew how to cause maximum damage, and in that isolated prison cell, the plans began to take shape in his head. The environment around him only hardened his resolve. He recalled being targeted by prison staff with racist abuse, seeing pork deliberately placed in Muslim inmates' food, and hearing threats hurled at prisoners attending Friday prayers. The hostility, both from staff and from other inmates, fed his anger. Hatred bred hatred, and for Sicarius, it pushed him closer to the edge. When he was released in 2009, the intent to carry out an attack was still alive in his mind. He even tried to make contact with a well-known figure linked to terrorism. That person never replied. Looking back, he sees that as a crucial moment. Without that connection and with the pull of his old gang life taking over, the plans began to fade. But at the time, he was still ready and fully willing to go through with it if the opportunity arose. When Sicarius McGrath walked out of prison in 2009, the world outside had changed, but so had he. His mind was still heavy with the ideas and resentments he had carried in segregation. Yet instead of stepping into the path he had planned, he was pulled back into a life he knew all too well: gangs, money, and violence. Old contacts reached out almost immediately. In Liverpool and beyond, Sicarius had a reputation as someone who could get things done. He had the connections, the nerve, and above all, access to firearms. Within months, he was back in the thick of organized crime, robbing drug dealers, extorting rivals, and moving weapons across city lines. These robberies weren't random. Sicarius targeted dealers with precision, often working with crews from outside Liverpool to avoid attracting too much local attention. He justified it to himself as taking from people he considered parasites, but the reality was simpler. It was lucrative, and it kept his name feared on the street. Rolex watches, cash, and kilos of drugs changed hands at gunpoint. The rewards were quick, and the risks felt manageable to someone used to danger. His involvement in the firearms trade deepened. He began supplying weapons, not just in Liverpool, but to gangs in other cities: London, Birmingham, Manchester. He was careful about who he armed locally, preferring to keep the most dangerous equipment out of the hands of anyone who might turn it on him. Many of the weapons he sold weren't fresh off the black market. They were reactivated from deactivated stock or converted from blank-firing replicas. He also produced ammunition himself, loading and modifying rounds for maximum impact. Sometimes he took things further, deliberately sabotaging weapons sold to people he didn't like. An overloaded bullet or a faulty barrel meant a buyer could end up injured if they tried to use it. For Sicarius, it was a way to settle scores without firing a shot himself. Despite the money flowing in, his life was never far from police attention. Many times he was arrested for crimes he hadn't committed, set up by rivals who wanted him out of the way. Some planted guns in his belongings. Others gave statements naming him as the culprit in shootings, stabbings, or kidnappings he had nothing to do with. He learned quickly that in the criminal world, enemies came in all forms, even supposed friends. For the next few years, Sicarius moved between violent robberies, high-stakes weapons deals, and mediation between rival gangs. In some disputes, he was paid thousands to broker peace, a role that mixed intimidation with negotiation. The goal was always the same: keep business running and avoid the chaos of an open street war. By 2012, he had stepped back from personally carrying out robberies, preferring to send others in his place. But the shift was only partial. He was still deeply entrenched in the underworld, still armed and still surrounded by violence. And while his days of plotting political attacks seemed behind him, his life remained one misstep away from disaster. By the time Sicarius McGrath reached his early 30s, his name was firmly tied to one of the most dangerous trades in the UK underworld, the supply of firearms. What had started as a way to protect himself during his teenage years had evolved into a full-scale operation, feeding weapons into some of the country's most volatile criminal networks. Sicarius understood the business better than most. He knew that in gang disputes, the side with the better firepower often dictated the outcome. That made him valuable, not just as a supplier, but as someone who could control who had access to certain weapons. He dealt in high-velocity rifles, shotguns, pistols, and converted blank firers, along with the ammunition to match. Some of these guns were sourced from Europe, others were reactivated decommissioned pieces, and many were customized in ways that made them deadlier. For him, this wasn't just about sales, it was about leverage. He could choose who got armed and who didn't, and in a world where grudges were deadly, that kind of control was worth more than money. He avoided arming people in Liverpool whenever possible, aware that a weapon sold to the wrong person could easily end up pointed at him. Instead, he focused on moving stock to gangs in the south of England, where the risk of immediate blowback was lower. There were times when people came to him openly stating their intent to commit a murder. In those moments, Sicarius made calculated decisions. If he thought the job was too messy, or if the risk of being dragged into a police investigation was high, he refused the deal. Other times, he sold weapons to people who believed they had his full support, while quietly altering the gun or the ammunition to ensure it wouldn't work as intended. He learned to diversify his dealings. Sometimes the firearms were sold outright, other times they were traded for cars, drugs, or other valuable commodities. The flexibility kept his operation fluid and difficult for police to pin down, but with every deal, the risk grew. Guns had a way of resurfacing, in police raids, at crime scenes, in the hands of someone who had been arrested and was now talking. One particular incident stayed with him. He'd brokered a deal for a vehicle, only to later learn it had been used in a serious shooting. Even though he hadn't pulled the trigger, the connection was enough to put him on the radar for a crime that could have brought a life sentence. It was a sharp reminder that in this line of work, guilt by association was more than a figure of speech. It could be a death sentence or a prison term. For nearly 3 years, Sicarius kept the flow of weapons steady. It was lucrative, but it also meant living under constant pressure. Every phone call could be bad news. Every knock at the door could be the police or someone seeking revenge, and while he thrived on control, he knew deep down that the firearms trade was a game no one could play forever without paying a heavy price. By 2017, Sicarius McGrath had been living in the shadows of crime for well over a decade. He had built a name as a man who could arm gangs, rob drug dealers, and broker peace between rivals when the price was right. But after years of living by the gun, something shifted, and it happened in a way he never expected. It began with a television documentary. Sitting in his prison cell, Sicarius watched the story of a young boy killed in a gang crossfire. The child had been on his way home from football practice when he was struck by a bullet meant for someone else. He wasn't involved in crime. He wasn't part of any feud. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The program showed his family in court, their grief laid bare for the world to see. Sicarius recognized one of the defendants, a man he had once considered a decent acquaintance. But watching that same man stand accused of murdering a child jolted him in a way nothing else had. For all the violence he'd been involved in, Sicarius had always drawn one hard line. Children were off limits. Seeing that boundary crossed shattered something inside him. He realized just how easily it could have been him in that courtroom. Over the years, he'd fired shots into houses to send a message. He'd pulled weapons on people to scare them into compliance. And he knew that if even one bullet had gone astray, through a window into the wrong room, an innocent child could have been killed. The thought lodged deep in his mind. For the first time, he began to see his actions not just as part of the game, but as reckless risks that could destroy lives in an instant. It was a sobering moment. Violence had always felt like a tool of the trade, a way to get results when negotiation failed, but the reality was far more chaotic. Bullets didn't always find their intended target, and in the world Sicarius lived in, accidents didn't come with second chances. That night, lying on his prison bunk, he replayed his own past. The robberies, the shootings, the beatings, times when people had been left bloodied and barely breathing. He had justified them all at the time. They were drug dealers, they were rivals, they had it coming. But now, for the first time, he considered the collateral damage. What if someone else had been there? What if a bystander had stepped into the line of fire? This wasn't an overnight transformation. Sicarius still had one foot in the criminal world. But the realization stayed with him. The glamour of the guns, the quick money, and the street reputation had begun to lose their shine. In their place came a growing awareness that if he didn't change course, one day he'd either be facing a life sentence or watching his own family grieve the way he'd seen that boy's family grieve. Leaving a life like Sicarius McGrath's was never going to be as simple as walking out the door. The underworld had a way of pulling people back in, through debts, old loyalties or grudges that never really died. But after that moment of clarity in 2017, he began to make small but deliberate changes. He started by cutting down his direct involvement in violent work. By then, he had already stepped back from personally carrying out robberies, preferring to use others for high-risk jobs. Now, he went further, declining certain firearms deals, refusing to supply weapons to people he suspected would use them recklessly, and avoiding disputes that could spiral into bloodshed. It wasn't a clean break, but it was a change in direction. The pull of his old life was still there. He had built relationships over years in the game, and walking away from them wasn't without consequence. Some people saw his reduced involvement as weakness. Others tested his resolve, trying to drag him back into conflicts. But Sicarius stayed focused, driven by the thought that one wrong move could undo everything. Gradually, his energy began shifting towards something else, steering others away from the same mistakes he had made. It started informally, speaking to younger men in his community or in prison, explaining the reality behind the lifestyle. He didn't sugarcoat it. He spoke about the paranoia, the betrayals, the constant threat of prison or death. And when the subject turned to violence, he was blunt. Pulling a knife or a gun might solve a problem in the moment, but it would cost you everything in the long run. He began volunteering with organizations that worked with at-risk youth. Sometimes it was in schools, other times on the streets or in meetings arranged by families desperate to keep their kids away from gangs. His approach was different from official programs. He didn't preach. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He spoke from experience, not as someone who had read about the dangers of gang life, but as someone who had lived it. There were moments when his intervention made a direct difference. He recalled two particular cases where young men had been ready to commit murder, one in Liverpool, another in Manchester. Both were armed and ready to pull the trigger. In each case, Sicarius spoke to them for hours, breaking down exactly what would happen if they went through with it, the prison time, the toll on their families, the weight of taking a life. In the end, both stood down. For him, those were small victories, proof that his voice could make an impact. The work wasn't always easy. Some young people listened. Others nodded politely but went back to their old ways. Sicarius accepted that he couldn't save everyone, but he also knew that even planting a seed, making someone think twice before carrying a weapon, was a step in the right direction. For the first time in years, he felt he was building something instead of destroying it. The roads he had once patrolled with a gun in his waistband now became the places where he tried to stop someone else from picking one up in the first place. For Sicarius McGrath, leaving violence behind didn't mean forgetting where he came from. His past was never far away, in the scars he carried, in the people he still encountered, and in the memories of nights when life could have changed with the pull of a trigger. But as the years passed, he learned to use that history as a tool rather than a weight. The same streets where he once ran armed now saw him in a different role. Instead of planning robberies or supplying weapons, he was showing up to talk young people out of making the choices he once made. The stories he told weren't glamorous. He spoke about paranoia, betrayal, and the loneliness that came when everyone around you wanted something: money, drugs, protection, but no one truly had your back. He also made a point of explaining the long reach of the law. Many of the young men he met believed they could escape consequences if they stayed clever. Sicarius broke down the reality: joint enterprise laws, conspiracy charges, and how even being near a violent crime could put you away for decades. He had seen too many friends spend the rest of their lives in cells for acts they didn't even commit themselves. But his work wasn't just about fear. It was about showing that another path was possible, even if it meant starting from scratch. He told them how walking away from crime had cost him money, connections, and status, but it had given him something more valuable: peace. No more constant looking over his shoulder. No more worrying about whether the next knock at the door was the police or a rival crew. Still, he didn't pretend the temptation was gone. Offers still came in. People still asked him to get hold of guns, to help sort out a dispute, to use his name to intimidate others. He knew saying yes would be easy money. But every time he remembered the faces of the families he'd seen grieving, and the thought of undoing years of change kept him steady. Outside of his work with young people, Sicarius kept a low profile. He had no interest in the spotlight, preferring to move quietly, building trust one conversation at a time. His past meant that some people would never fully believe he had changed. He accepted that. Redemption wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about living differently, day after day. When asked if he regretted his past, his answer was complicated. He regretted the harm, the fear, and the danger he'd brought into other people's lives. But he also knew those experiences gave him a voice that young people listened to, not because he was perfect, but because he had been exactly where they were standing. In that sense, his history had become his most powerful tool. For Sicarius McGrath, life after violence was about more than survival. It was about making sure the next generation didn't have to learn the hard way that in the criminal world, the ending is always the same: prison, death, or a lifetime looking over your shoulder. Today, Sicarius McGrath carries himself with a calmness that would have been unthinkable in his younger years. The restless, angry teenager who once prowled Liverpool's streets armed and ready for conflict has been replaced by a man who speaks with measured conviction. His life is no longer about territory, reputation, or fear. Instead, it's about prevention, making sure others don't repeat his mistakes. He doesn't deny where he came from. In fact, he's honest about it in a way that surprises many. He admits to the robberies, the gun deals, the violent disputes, and the brushes with extremism. He doesn't romanticize any of it. In his words, those years were a constant gamble where the stakes were either years behind bars or a burial plot, and he came close to both more times than he cares to count. Now his work takes him into the spaces where trouble brews: the estates, the schools, the community centers where young men hover on the edge of gang life. He listens more than he talks, but when he does speak, it's with the kind of credibility that only comes from lived experience. He tells them how easy it is to get pulled in, how fast things can escalate, and how hard it is to step away once the lines are crossed. He's also clear about the bigger picture. The violence that consumed his youth wasn't just about individuals, it was about cycles: poverty, lack of opportunity, the lure of fast money, and the thrill of respect on the streets all fed into a system that kept people trapped. Sicarius wants to break that cycle, even if only for one person at a time. Life outside of crime hasn't made him rich, but it has given him something more valuable: the freedom to sleep at night without fearing a raid or a revenge attack, the peace of not having to scan every room for threats, the knowledge that he's no longer adding to the harm he once spread. He knows some will never forgive him for his past. That's fine with him. His goal isn't to win public approval, it's to reach the young men who are still making the same choices he once did. If they hear his story and think twice before picking up a weapon, he considers that a success. There are still moments when the past catches up with him, faces from old disputes, places that stir old memories. But these days, he chooses not to step back into that world. He has built a new role for himself, one grounded in honesty, hard lessons, and the belief that change is possible, even for those who seem too far gone. Sicarius McGrath's journey hasn't been a straight line from darkness to light. It's been messy, complicated, and at times dangerously close to ending in disaster. But the man he is now stands as proof that even the most entrenched lives can take a different turn. And for every young person who listens, his past becomes not just a warning, but a reason to believe in a way out.